Nova in a Bottle by John Kennedy. Originally published in the January 1978 issue of Galileo magazine. Republished in a 1992 book named for this story, which combines it with just one other of his stories called Encore from 1989, as well as essays about him by fellow authors, including Connie Willis. An updated version of this book came out in 2003, including several more of Kennedy's stories. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Nova in a Bottle. There was no sound but for the wind. Nothing moved except the dust and sand. The sun was a hazy red ball a few degrees above the horizon. With his sensors on auto alert, the soldier slept, soundly, dreamlessly. 20 minutes before his scheduled wake-up call, he heard the echoing crunch of explosives. Awake now, he listened as the echoes faded, replaced by the persistent tick of wind-blown sand against his exoskeleton. It was not the sound of a sky strike. Somewhere out there a friendly was engaging the enemy. The soldier felt a mild irritation. He had come to think of this wasteland in a proprietary way. He hadn't seen a friendly in over a year. Slowly, he rolled from beneath the low outcrop that had sheltered him during the night and stood up. His 3-meter exoskeleton was, at the moment, the same mottled color as the rocks that surrounded him. In the dim light of morning, he was virtually invisible. With a speed and agility that belied his size and obvious mass, he scrambled up the rocky slope to a higher vantage point. He stopped with just his bubble helmet above the level of the plateau. Waves of red dust danced across the barren rock. He had no need to turn his head. The helmet fed a full 360-degree image into his brain. Across the plateau, about a kilometer off, the soldier saw a column of thick black smoke. Clearly, the action had taken place in the narrow canyon on the other side of the plateau. The cratered rock offered little in the way of cover, so he decided on a quick sprint. After a final scan for air patrols, the soldier hoisted himself over the lip of the plateau and, with a burst of speed that turned his massive mechanical legs into a blur, ran for the other side. He covered the kilometer in just over 30 seconds. Billows of black smoke rolled over the edge of the plateau, surrounding the soldier and obscuring the canyon from visual observation. Automatically, his scanners shifted into other areas of the spectrum. He saw a dozen hot spots, but they were blurred and indistinct. There was one very bright area of hard radiation about 200 meters to his left. Twice he saw the lance of laser fire. Since he could learn nothing useful from his present position, he decided, he moved down into the canyon. The boulder-strewn slope was not steep, and, with the aid of his sonar system, the soldier picked an easy route that took him beyond the veil of smoke. He could see a large number of exos and mules scattered, motionless on the canyon floor. Among the exos, he saw only one warrior. Most of the smoke came from a medium destroyer with both its turrets blown off. It didn't look like a hit-and-run job. Someone had taken the time to set up an efficient trap. A flicker of motion within the smoke caught his eye. The soldier magnified that part of his visual field, wondering if some of the enemy had survived the attack. What he saw was a modified form of an ancient VK engineer mech. It had the requisite cylindrical body, slightly flattened on the bottom, and 6 triple-jointed legs. The additions included a dorsal carrying rack, almost twice normal size, an extra pair of arms on what was usually the rear, and a pair of laser cannons, one on each end. Its ability to move in any direction with complete coordination was also unusual. It had been a long time since the soldier had last felt surprise, but he felt it now. Where, he wondered, were the rest of the troops? Surely one lone mech, and an engineer at that, couldn't have caused the devastation that littered the canyon floor. The soldier had an intimate knowledge of what it took to survive this deep in enemy territory, and he knew a mech didn't have it. It would need at least a Class 2 controller. But then, how could a controller... Too many questions without enough data. Wait. Still as the rocks about him, the soldier watched the old mech loot the enemy dead. Then, for no reason discernible to the soldier, it picked up the exo-warrior with its hind arms and moved rapidly away from the battleground. Moving now, low among the boulders, the soldier followed. He'd moved less than 10 meters when a laser beam sliced through a rock, mere centimeters from his helmet, and then touched his armored shoulder. The exoskeleton's rock color camouflage automatically changed to a perfectly reflective mirror. As he leaped to the side, the soldier caught one quick glimpse of the mech. Somehow it had managed to get above him. The soldier headed up toward the plateau using what cover he could find. He stumbled into a jumble of rocks that offered shelter on 3 sides. He squatted with his back against the rocks and boosted his audio sensitivity to max, filtering out wind sounds. He heard metal against rock. Which way? He couldn't be sure with all the echoes. "Exo?" a voice roared. The soldier damped the audio. The sounds were too erratic to do any good. He pulled the heavy-duty disruptor from its niche in his right thigh. "I think we should talk, don't you?" The voice was quieter now, but it sounded close. It didn't sound like a mech's voice. It had too much expression. "All right," the soldier said. "Where are you?" "Right here." With unbelievable speed, the mech streaked around the boulder to the soldier's left. Before the soldier could even raise his disruptor, the mech had clamped a claw-like manipulator around the weapon and pressed a disruptor of its own against the soldier's chest. "No need for that." The mech gently pulled the disruptor out of the soldier's grip and stepped back. Slowly, the soldier stood up. He was about a meter taller than the mech. He was amazed. He'd never seen a mech move with such tremendous speed. Silently, he stared down into the mech's shiny little visual receptors and waited. "Sorry I fired at you," the mech said. "Thought you were the enemy. It's unusual to find a friend in this area. I trust you are unharmed." "I'm all right." "Good." The mech paused. When it spoke again, it sounded almost reluctant. "I've discovered an ancient habitat near here which is unknown to the enemy. I would be gratified if you would care to visit it." "Do I have a choice?" "Of course." The mech put away its disruptor and held the soldiers out to him. The soldier took the weapon, silently contemplating the strange old mech. He replaced the disruptor in its storage niche. "I'll come." "Fine." The mech turned and started up the hill toward the plateau. "Follow me," it called. He saw that the mech still carried the enemy armor in its rear arms. The mech's 6 legs were well suited to the rough terrain and bore it to the plateau with slightly more speed than the soldier could manage. When the soldier reached the top, he found the mech standing next to a shallow crater, apparently waiting. "There is one thing I have to do before we proceed," the mech said. It dropped the enemy armor with a clang. The wind had died, and a small cloud of dust hung in the air. "Notice the remaining limb," the mech said. One of the enemy's arms and both legs were missing. The soldier squatted beside the enemy. The arm was different. The soldier's hands reached to and articulated within the bulging slave unit at the armor's wrist. Beyond were the mechanical manipulators that mimicked and amplified his hand movements. The mech touched the enemy limb with one of its manipulators. Too small for an arm to fit inside. The mech pulled a small circular saw from a compartment behind one of its legs. There were 2 other exos like this one. They were very fast. With the saw, the mech made a quick, deep cut into the breastplate of the enemy armor. It cut from groin to throat, then from shoulder to shoulder. As it cut at the waist, from left to right, clear fluid began to leak out of the thin gap, and the blade spun a misty, glittering spray into the air. When the cuts were completed, the mech pulled the armor open. With a scissors-like tool, it cut through layers of insulation, cloth, and plastic, exposing the enemy warrior's torso. The only thing that covered it was a clear, fluid-filled membrane. The mech split the membrane with the scissors, but the opening closed almost as soon as it was made, losing very little moisture. "Interesting," the mech said. "This is..." Suddenly it stopped and turned its front end toward the east. "What is it?" "Listen." The mech lowered its body until its belly was against the dirt. The small laser projector between its eye stalks moved slowly back and forth. Then the soldier heard it, a low, whining purr. He snapped his laser from its holder on his back and dropped to his belly. He flipped the power cord to make sure it was free, then waited. Moments later, a small black object came over the edge of the plateau. The soldier telescoped his view and tracked. He saw black wings against the gritty orange sky. The thing had a wingspan of less than 2 meters, and it wobbled as it flew. The soldier recognized the object and relaxed slightly. "One of ours," he said. "Yes," the mech agreed, but its laser was still locked onto the flyer. It was a drone, a small nuclear bomb that flew a meter above the ground and had a range of over 5,000 kilometers. The drone swept by less than 100 meters from them, swooping and climbing as it followed the terrain. The soldier could see a small jagged hole in the side of the flyer. "Damaged," he said. He rose to a kneeling position as the drone dropped over the far edge of the plateau. "That's why we could hear it coming, I suppose." "Most likely," the mech said, standing again. "However, it doesn't have far to go." "What do you mean?" The mech had returned to the enemy soldier, but it paused momentarily. "We're less than 150 kilometers from the enemy dome." The soldier was both elated and stunned. He had been wandering around the area for 6 months without knowing how close he was to his goal. All he had noticed was a greater number of craters, and the bombs that made them, and fewer ground patrols. He said as much to the mech. "This is Target Prime." As if to punctuate the mech's statement, there was a ground-shaking explosion a few kilometers to the south. A sky strike, much larger than could be caused by a drone. "Besides," the mech continued, "why waste patrols around here? They know a large force could never penetrate this deep into their territory, and how much can we hurt them?" The mech returned to its study of the enemy warrior. The featureless bubble helmet had a small laser hole in the center. Carefully, again using the saw, the mech cut a large window in the front of the helmet. The soldier, still thinking about what the mech had said, stood up. He pointed to the rising column of smoke. "What about that? I've done as much myself, many times. You say it doesn't hurt them?" "Correct," the mech replied as it lifted the front of the enemy's helmet off. "Why do you think I can take the time to examine this soldier? I know we won't be bothered. I destroyed a scavenger patrol that was out looking for usable metals and equipment. It makes no difference to them. In a few days, another patrol will come out and salvage what they can from the patrol I shot up, and that's it. The soldier had a vague sense of unease. For a moment, he considered destroying the mech. His laser was still in his hand, and the mech was busy trying to cut the membrane. No, he decided, the thing's too fast. And despite its disconcerting ideas, the mech's behavior aroused the soldier's curiosity. No need to terminate it now. He stowed his laser and squatted opposite the mech with the enemy between them. The mech finally managed to split the membrane fast and wide enough to keep it from repairing itself, and the fluid splashed onto the ground and beat it up in dusty balls. The soldier bent close to look at the enemy's face. There were only shallow depressions where the eyes should have been. The nose was so flat as to be almost non-existent, and the mouth was a lipless, toothless slit. The laser hole was just below the right cheekbone. "Grown without arms or legs," the mech said. "Legs?" the soldier thought, puzzled. With a few deft strokes, the mech opened the corpse and began to examine the viscera. The lenses on its eye stalks were only centimeters from their object of interest. Each organ was carefully removed, examined, and discarded in the dirt. Within minutes, working so fast that the soldier couldn't follow most of its movements, the mech was finished. The neural system is so closely tied into the armor's control mechanisms that they cannot be separated. This one was never meant to come out of his armor. The soldier stood up. He was both fascinated and repelled by the lengths to which the enemy would go. The wind had picked up again, and the enemy's glistening viscera dulled as they became coated with dust. "Somewhat different setup than yours, I assume." "Yes," the soldier said. "I have the standard neural link-ups, base of spine and back of the skull, but I can unplug. This creature couldn't. I can function outside my armor." He nudged the enemy with his boot. "This is a mech with guts." Silently, the mech cleaned and stowed its tools. It took a small incendiary device from its dorsal rack and dropped it into the enemy's armor. The device flared briefly, and the soldier and the mech cast shadows across the plateau that even the sun couldn't brighten. The mech turned toward the east. "Let's go." The soldier followed, ignoring the burning carcass that his all-inclusive vision wouldn't let him look away from. The entrance to the mech's underground city was in the wall of an old but still radioactive crater. What appeared as a crack in the glassy wall gave access to a narrow tunnel with a steep downward slant leading to a vertical shaft. Two parallel rows of metal rungs set into one wall of the shaft, about 3 meters apart, were just right for the mech. The soldier lowered himself almost as quickly with a pair of thin cables that unwound from his belt. The shaft was almost 600 meters deep, and he had to reattach the cables 3 times before he reached bottom. The bottom of the shaft was filled with a jumble of loose rocks and dirt. The soldier had the impression that it had been quite a bit deeper when it was new. A wide split in the shaft wall opened into another downward-sloping rock fracture. It was wide and high, and the soldier had no trouble matching the mech's rapid progress. The fracture led to an enormous cavern. The soldier's echo sounder fed him a picture of huge pointed formations reaching up from the cavern's floor to meet other, even larger spikes that hung from the ceiling. A smooth, flat reflection off to one side was obviously a lake. The soldier followed the mech to the lake, but stopped as the mech splashed into the water. "It's less than 2 meters deep here," the mech said. After a moment, the soldier followed. An unusual shape that had puzzled the soldier turned out to be a horizontal tube over 6 meters in diameter and shrouded in a maze of support stanchions. "This is part of an old transport system," the mech said. "There's a large network of caves in this area, and they used them whenever they could." "How extensive is this transport system?" "It covered the entire planet." "It still functions?" the soldier asked, surprised. "Oh, no, not for about 600 years. Most of it is in ruins. I had to rebore the tunnels with a mole. There is a gap in the tube wall," the mech pointed to the right, "about 500 meters from here." The inside diameter of the tube was over 4 meters. However, little time passed before they reached a collapsed section where the mech's mole had cut a new tunnel. The mech-built tunnels were round and smooth as ice and only half the size of the original tunnels, and the soldier had to squat walk much of the distance. The first barrier they met was a gas-tight door in a narrow cul-de-sac off the main tunnel. Manually, the mech unsealed the door and pushed it inward. It moved soundlessly on massive hinges. The mech stepped through, and, ducking beneath the lintel, the soldier followed. Beyond the door, the halls seemed newer. The soldier realized it was because of the lack of debris that littered all the other ancient tunnels. "Did you repair these tunnels?" the soldier asked. "No, I didn't." The soldier waited, but the mech said nothing more. The hall gradually began to slope downward, and the soldier had to move along in an awkward sideways stoop to avoid losing his balance. They passed through 2 more gas-tight doors and finally halted in a large room with high ceilings and yellowish lighting. The first light the soldier had seen since leaving the surface. The mech cycled the last door and stood back. "Welcome to my home," it said, waving its manipulator toward the door. The soldier walked into a high, narrow cave. He saw light and walked toward it, and then halted just inside the cave mouth. What he saw he couldn't explain. Outside the cave was a blue sky, a deep, clear blue, with a few wisps of pink clouds high up. Curving into the distance below was a vast, color-filled crater. Behind, the mech stood waiting, silent. "What is that?" "The forest." "Forest?" The soldier walked out of the cave. He stood at the edge of a rock shelf and looked down. The ground dropped away in a gentle slope toward a large, placid lake, about a kilometer distant. Farther down the hill, he could see a wall of narrow shafts, topped with a confusion of shifting shapes and colors. "It would be better if your visual input was unaugmented," the mech said, "as if you were without your armor." The soldier complied, narrowing the spectrum he could perceive. Things took on sharper edges, and the colors muted to various shades of green, brown, red, and gold. The mech brushed past him and started down a winding path. "Come on, my house is by the lake." As the soldier followed, he sent a few electronic pulses toward the sky and, as he had expected, got an echo. The sky was an immense dome with simulated clouds and sun. What a tremendous amount of energy it must consume, he thought. The mech gave him a lecture as they walked, naming the tall shafts trees, at least 20 different kinds, and pointing out other flora of almost infinite variety. The soldier didn't even try to remember them all. They crossed a small stone bridge that arched a stream. The water was transparent, and the soldier was sure he saw a dark shape move among the rocks, but the mech didn't stop, so he didn't either. Once the mech did stop, and it looked at the ground beside the path. It extended its visual receptors and studied something closely. The soldier looked, but all he saw was a rock with a red-gold stain of no interest. "Lichen," the mech said. The path branched many times, and at one of the branchings they met a tiny mech with wide wheels and a load of digging tools. The little mech paused to let them pass. The soldier watched it roll up the path until a bend took it from sight. The mech's house was a glassed-in space beneath a slanting slab of rock, large enough for the soldier to stand upright. The floor was of some blue material that gave slightly under the soldier's weight. The only thing in the room was a small three-legged table with an oval dish on it. The dish held a mound of earth and 5 small trees. Birch? The soldier wasn't sure. At first he thought they were artificial, but when he took a closer look, he discovered that they were real, with perfect leaves less than a centimeter long. The view from the room was restricted to a part of the lake and a small tree-covered island a few meters offshore. "How long since you've been out of your exoskeleton?" 18 months. "Maintenance?" "Nothing but field for a year." "Why?" "I have a fully equipped workshop, and I was wondering if you would like to have me fix that laser burn I put in your shoulder." "The response is a bit sluggish." The soldier was silent for a few moments, considering. The forest seemed safe enough. Perhaps he could risk it. "All right." "Fine," the mech said. "First, though, let me fix you an ambo device you can use while I work on your armor." The soldier waited. For the first time in months, he felt an inner calm. It worried him because he hadn't realized he was tense until the feeling faded from the pit of his stomach. He walked to the edge of the lake and watched the wavelets lap the shore, again marveling at the energy involved. An artificial wind to make waves and hiss through the trees. When the sun went down behind the crater rim, he went back into the mech's house and sat down close to the rear wall. As the light faded outside, pale lights began to glow behind squares in the ceiling, and soon the soldier could see his exoskeleton reflected on the inside of the glass wall. "Soldier?" The soldier stood up. "I have your walker ready." "All right," the soldier said. The mech led him through the door in the rear wall. They spiraled down a wide ramp that was almost high enough for the soldier to walk upright. The mech's workshop seemed to have all the equipment that any military armorer would have, except that it was all set up to handle only one exoskeleton. In one corner stood a pair of meter-long legs, the soldier's walker. "Why do you have all this?" the soldier asked, indicating the repair tools. "Surely you can't have that many visitors." "I used to work on the forest mechs. I make modifications, repairs, build originals." The soldier stepped to the dais and lowered himself onto it. The bulky life support unit on the exoskeleton's back fit into a wide slot in the surface of the dais. With a convulsive jerk, the armored exoskeleton lifted itself onto its elbows. The front of the armor split along an invisible seam, and the helmet dropped back until it touched the dais. Slowly, struggling, the soldier emerged like a moth from its chrysalis, looking pale and damp. Nappy black hair covered his skull like a knitted cap. He had a thin, flat nose, and his mouth was wide and full-lipped. His epicanthic eyes, wide and unfocused, were gray. He sat there for a moment, blinking. He was still getting sensory input from his armor, and he couldn't reconcile it with the view his eyes gave him. He reached behind his head and disconnected the primary interface. He shook his head as if to clear it and squinted. The room's lights were so dim he could hardly see the mech, and closed in. No longer able to see what was behind him, he felt an uncontrollable need to know, and he kept turning his head, looking around. The silence, the cold, the total vulnerability pressed him from all sides. He felt a tightness in his chest, a gripping ache that wasn't new to him, but nonetheless he had never grown used to. He began to gasp, short, shallow breaths, and he heard a high-pitched whine that seemed to fill his head. The mech extended a manipulator and touched the soldier's arm with a hypojet it had been holding in readiness. The soldier felt the sting, and then the waves of tranquility swept through his body. His respirations slowed, and his vision cleared. He sat quietly for a few moments and then unhooked the waste drain attached to his belly. Finally, he unplugged the secondary interface from the base of his spine. He reached into the armor and pulled out a gray coverall. Balancing on one hand, he slipped the coverall over the lower part of his legless body. Then, sitting again, he pushed his arms into the sleeves and fastened the front. With one hand, he flipped himself out of his armor to the floor. He stood there on his hands, the blunt end of his short body a few centimeters above the floor, looking up at the mech. He was 145 centimeters tall. "Well," he said, "I'll try that walker now." The mech lifted him into the cup-shaped support atop the legs. He leaned into the back brace and tightened the webbed security straps around his chest and shoulders. "The interface is the same as in your armor," the mech said. The soldier twisted slightly to locate the plug, then slipped it through the slit in his coveralls. There was a quiet click as he fit to the plate at the base of his spine. He tried a few cautious steps. The legs, unlike those of his armor, had no outer coverings, and he watched the workings of the gears, wires, and hydraulics with interest. "Good," he said. "Where's the power pack?" The walker was shorter than he had expected. In his armor, he sat on the power pack, and it was bulky, adding another 30 centimeters to the height of his armor. "Broadcast power," the mech said. "The walker will work anywhere in the forest." "I see." Not the best of situations, but not that unexpected. The mech rolled a number of diagnostic machines to the dais and placed them around the soldier's armor. It removed a plate in the armor's left axilla and inserted a dozen probes. Finally, it pulled 3 bell-shaped stress scanners from the underside of the dais and arranged their telescoping arms around the foot of the armor. "I don't have the shielding you would need to observe the initial workup, so you had better return to the upper level." "All right." The soldier walked slowly to the exit, adjusting to his new legs. "I'm not needed in the early phases," the mech said, "so I'll be up momentarily." "Fine." By the time the soldier reached the upper room, he felt at ease with the walker. He squatted against the back wall with the dish of small trees. "Hungry?" The soldier started violently and jerked around. The mech had entered silently while he was looking out the windows. "Relax, you're safe here." "Sure." The soldier's face twitched in a rictus grin. His eyes moved constantly. "I'm not used to this." His hand moved in a vague gesture, and he noticed that it was trembling. He stared at it briefly, then crossed his arms and tucked his hands into his armpits. "Can you cover those windows?" the soldier said. "Of course." The windows changed to a non-reflective gray. "Thank you." "Hungry?" the mech asked again. "No, I ate 2 days ago." The two were silent for a long time. The soldier grew calm again, gradually adjusting to his diminished sensory input. Finally, the mech spoke again. You must be quite experienced to have survived this long in enemy territory. I've had a lot of years to perfect the skill. I'm unable to judge the age of humans, the mech said. I have no trouble with machines, but humans have too many inconsistencies. Do you have superstitions concerning such matters? Not anymore. May I ask how old you are? 37 hours short of 20 years. I see, the mech said. What is your line? Totaku 2020. The soldier was the 20th clone in the 20th generation of the Totaku line. He and his 19 brothers had been cloned when one of the members of the 19th generation had reached the age of 20. And so it had been, with an unbroken line of warriors stretching back 400 years to the first Totaku. Are there other survivors in your line? No, the soldier said quietly. I'm the last. You'll be going back home then? No. Why not? You've reached the mandatory age unless they've changed it. It's the same. Then why aren't you going back? They have to clone you now. It's the law. I'm going to get into the enemy dome and end the war. Such an attempt will achieve nothing. The dome is impregnable. You will die, and your line will cease to exist. If the war were finished, there would be no need for my line. Also, if I succeed, my line will be the most famous of all the warrior lines. How will they know it was you? I'm not sure about that yet. The soldier stared at the miniature trees for a few moments and then looked up at the mech. You could tell them. I have no contact with Central. You could send a message. They'd get it. You'll never get into the dome. Again, the brief grin, less strained. I think I will. The mech didn't answer, and the soldier decided not to press the machine. He had no real information about the mech, and he had no way to predict its behavior. How did it function this far beyond the net? It was a strange old machine, the oldest mech he had ever seen. Just when were you brought into service? The soldier asked. I was activated 202 years ago in Takzul. My official designation was Experimental Autonomous Remote Mechanical Mark II. I was designed to work in the field, to make repairs and modifications in combat. I've never heard of autonomous mechs, the soldier said. I don't imagine you have. The experiment didn't work out and they terminated the ARM series. What happened? The arms were, of necessity, heuristic. We were designed to function completely outside the net, and Central had no direct control over us. Eventually, the arms that weren't destroyed in combat deserted. Why did all of you desert? I never talked to the others. However, speaking only for myself, I found the work to be non-rewarding, futile, frustrating, and a direct threat to my continued existence. I headed south, out of the combat zone to the uninhabited regions. I discovered one of the ancient underground cities, and I explored it. I explored the tunnels that still existed, and eventually I built a mole to clear the collapsed tunnels. It was during that period that I made the first significant modifications to my physical structure. After exploring for about 60 years, I ended up here in the forest, and I stayed. I've been here 133 years. The soldier didn't say anything when the mech stopped talking. He just stood there, lost in turbulent thoughts. It was difficult to cope with the idea that someone or something could quit. Just walk away from all of it. The mech was clearly defective. When the exoskeleton was repaired, the mech would have to be terminated. He would have to devise another method of notifying Central. "I must return to the workshop," the mech said. "Is there anything you want?" "Yes," the soldier said after a moment. He wasn't sure how the mech would react. "There's a compartment in the top of my armor's life support unit. Don't touch it." "Agreed." Abruptly, saying nothing, the mech left the room. He wondered how much the mech would let him get away with. He sighed. Again, too little information. He was settling into a rest state, prepared to wait out the night, when he noticed that the lights in the room had grown dimmer. It seemed that the windows had cleared slightly, too. He walked to the door, and it hissed open. A cool breeze caressed his face, and he took a deep breath. The air was damp. It looked as though the sky was growing lighter. "Dawn?" he thought, stepping out onto the gravel walk. The crunch of the gravel was loud in the forest stillness. He stood by the lake and watched the mist rise like smoke from a dying fire. It was all wrong, he knew. It had only been dark for a couple of hours. Was his usually excellent time sense beginning to fail him? He shivered from more than just the cold. As the first red-gold light touched the trees on the crater rim, he wondered how long it would take the mech to finish with the exoskeleton. When the mech left the soldier, it didn't go to the workshop. It took another turn off the down spiral and ran through a narrow 3-kilometer tunnel that led to the Guardian. The mech stood on the edge of the pit, its visual receptors aimed at the small cylinder that held the Guardian's essence. "Did you obtain the material I need?" the Guardian asked. It spoke a mixture of its own ancient language and the mech's modern one. "Yes, the raid was successful. What of the soldier you brought back?" "I want you to let him go wherever he wants." "I cannot allow him to harm the forest," the Guardian said. "I'll watch him. It's important that he not be interfered with." "Will he teach you what you want to know?" "I don't know. Perhaps he can. Will you leave him alone?" "Yes." He walked the forest paths for many hours before he found the kiosk. It was in the middle of a small glade, like the hub of a wheel, paths radiating like spokes in a dozen directions. Except for the mech's house, it was the first artificial structure he had seen in the forest. The kiosk was an open building of rough logs and planks. A small device of metal tubes and wire hung from one of the rafters, and when the wind moved it, the tubes struck one another, producing clear, ringing tones. The soldier watched the device for a few moments. He found the sounds eerie and distasteful. At the rear of the kiosk was a flight of steps leading down to a lighted room. The high-ceilinged room was about 100 meters long. One wall was lined with small, glass-fronted rooms. The other wall opened onto a platform overlooking a wide channel. The walls higher up were covered with maps crisscrossed with intersecting lines. The soldier realized he was in one of the transport stations the mech had mentioned. The soldier walked to the nearest of the glassed-in rooms and, cupping his hands against the glass to kill the reflections, looked in. Though the inside of the glass was dirty, enough light filtered in. There was a long counter across the back of the room, and a few shards of broken mirror adhered to the wall. He saw pieces of broken furniture strewn about, but the skeletons were what held his eyes. One skeleton rested against the glass about a meter from the soldier. and he moved closer to study it. He could see that the skeleton was that of a human, at least from the hips up, but it had legs. The soldier looked into other rooms and found the same scene repeated again and again, and the skeletons were the same too, all had legs. He recalled the mech's words on the plateau. It had looked at the enemy warrior and said, "Grown without arms or legs." Slowly, the soldier climbed the steps. He left the kiosk and picked the nearest path, not caring where it led. Could those skeletons have belonged to mutants? He wondered. Perhaps they'd been modified for some special purpose. Unless... He considered the thought uneasily. Unless he, Totaku 2020, had been modified. He had never seen a man with legs, not in the creche or in combat. He decided to ask the mech. He looked around, saw the lake through the trees, and started back. He noticed that half the sky was gray with clouds. Darker streaks of gray hung like a veil across part of the crater. He began to run, his tireless metal legs perfectly synchronized with his neural system. He was less than 50 meters from the mech's house when the first large drops began to fall. He reached the house with damp shoulders, but otherwise fairly dry. The rain was heavy, moving in sheets across the lake and up the path, splattering against the window with a thrumming insistence. He turned to the door that led to the mech's workshop just as the mech came through it. "How's the armor coming along?" the soldier said. "Slowly. I've found a number of worn pathways that should be renewed. He hesitated, not sure what he really wanted to say, but he had to ask. "I found some skeletons." "I know. How?" "My remote sensory system is quite extensive." Of course, the soldier thought. Were they mutants? No. The legs. They were cloned with legs? Not exactly. Explain. All right. Follow me, please. The mech led the soldier down the spiral ramp again, but this time to another room past the entrance to the workshop. It had the appearance of a control room of some sort. Clusters of active three-dimensional view screens showed different pictures of the forest. 2 screens, the soldier noted, showed the interior of the transport station. The mech directed the soldier's attention to a blank screen that was at least twice the size of the others. An image flickered, jerked, then solidified. Another view of the transport station, but filled with people. The soldier moved closer. A shiny silver cylinder slid into view, and a dozen people disembarked. Many of them were naked except for belts, bracelets, necklaces, and an assortment of shoulder bags. Types of clothing varied widely, from simple bands of colored material across the loins and chest to elaborate, flowing garments that brushed the floor. Some of the people left the station immediately, while others entered the glass-walled rooms. What are they doing? They've just come to spend some time in the forest, the mech said. The two watched the scene silently. They saw the arrival of another transport, watched the people come and go. Most of what the people did was a mystery to the soldier, but they held his interest. Can you freeze the view? All the motion stopped. Can you enlarge that? The soldier pointed. A figure expanded to fill the screen. The image was three-dimensional, but slightly blurred. The figure was naked, with alternating blue and red stripes across the torso. What's that hose thing hanging on him? The mech explained the function of the penis and then went into elimination of wastes. Seems complicated, the soldier said. My system is more efficient. The mech didn't comment. Isn't it? The soldier demanded. I suppose so, the mech admitted. Let's see that one, the soldier said, pointing again. The mech caused another figure to fill the screen. That one's different. What's wrong with him? That's a female. Why are they different? The mech explained the differences and added a short lecture on the process of procreation. You're joking, the soldier said, looking at the mech's little red eyes. You think humans were always cloned? You think humans were always cloned? He thought about it, looking at the female again. I don't know. I suppose so. His hands fluttered in a gesture of helplessness. I never thought about it. He looked away from the large screen, facing the forest views. These scenes date from before the war, the mech said. Almost 700 years. The soldier laughed. Before? That sounds strange. You can think of an end, but not a beginning? The soldier didn't answer. He looked back at the large screen. Do people like those live in the enemy dome? I don't know. What about our dome? I was never in it. Maybe. I've seen enough, the soldier said. All right. The mech blanked the screen, and they returned to the upper level. The soldier stood at the windows, looking out. The rain had stopped. The sun was out again, and steam rose off the gravel walk. Half the sky was still dark, and the colors of the rain-wet trees stood out with a vivid, multicolored brilliance. How far is the dome from here? The soldier asked, without turning. About 175 kilometers to the west. How soon will my armor be ready? You'll never get inside the dome. I want the armor ready by the beginning of my 20th year. You'll never get close to the dome. Unless I'm wrong, that gives you 25 hours. Why didn't you listen? Can you get it done? I don't understand humans. I've never been able to understand how your minds work. You have no sense of logic. The soldier turned from the window and looked at the mech. You weren't designed to understand us, he said, coldly. You were built to serve us. You failed at that. You're a freak, an experiment gone wrong. Here's your chance to make up for it. Do what you were designed to do. Help me get into that dome. The mech stood silently for a long while. The soldier had no idea how it would react to what he had said. He was aware that the mech could kill him without the slightest effort, but he felt no fear. He looked away from the mech's gleaming visual receptors and watched cloud shadows move across the forest. I will have your armor ready, Totaku, the mech said quietly. Later, when the soldier looked around, the mech had left. The soldier nodded slowly and looked at the forest again. What will you do now? The guardian asked. What choice do I have? The mech had finished the soldier's armor less than an hour after their final conversation, then had gone to the guardian's chamber. You could hold him here. He is powerless in the forest. I will let him go. The mech paused for many long seconds. I will take him to the dome. Your thinking is dangerously illogical. Such an action will result in your termination. Perhaps. Compute your probability of survival. No need, the mech said. You will never understand what it is to live. the Guardian said. "You are not a sentient creature. We've had this conversation before. There is no reason, philosophical or mechanical, why I can't become sentient. Life is necessary. You do not, cannot live. You will not know what it is to live without being alive. You cannot attain sentience without life. If I can never attain sentience, what reason do I have to continue my existence? Why shouldn't I go with the soldier? Why shouldn't I terminate? You need no reason for existence. You have a reason, the mech said. You have the forest. You exist to maintain the forest. I've exceeded the limits of my design, but I have nothing to replace them. Nonsense. You avoid my question. Why shouldn't I terminate? Illogical. Not in this case. The mech paused. Do you know why you want me to stay? The Guardian said nothing. Does the prospect of my termination cause you discomfort? The Guardian said nothing. Does it? Yes. That's illogical, Guardian, and that displays sentience. Again, silence filled the chamber as the Guardian considered what the mech had said. What about your own sentience? The Guardian asked, finally. What do you mean? You can see it in the soldier and you attribute it to me, but you are not sure of your own. I'm not sure that I can be aware of my own sentience. It may not be accessible through logic. There were only 20 arm units brought into service, and because of the nature of our duties, each of us developed unique characteristics. I have nothing to compare my thoughts to. I don't know if my thoughts are even remotely similar to the thoughts of another intelligent being. Then how will you know if you are sentient? I can't answer that. Perhaps even my awareness of self is no more than illusion. Soon after the mech left, the soldier walked into the forest again. He found the wet smells, rocks, dirt, leaves. Strange, but not unpleasant. The calm he had felt when he first entered the forest had returned and was stronger than before. He wondered what it would be like to live here, to quit like the mech. The thought no longer aroused a sense of revulsion, and vaguely, just on the edge of his awareness, he was bothered. The forest was so quiet. There is no evil here, he thought. No death. Again, the soldier found himself in front of the small kiosk. The shadows were long, and the golden light filled the glade like a mist. The wind chimes hung silent in the warm, listless air. He ran his hand over his nappy black hair. It was damp with sweat. He remembered the map in the transport station. Maybe it could be useful with the new information the mech had given him. He descended the steps and once more stared at the dark map high on the wall. Quickly, in his mind, he traced the path he had followed from the surface to the forest. Then he tried to locate the enemy dome. It was possible that it had been built after the tunnels had fallen from use and wasn't on the map, but maybe, just maybe, he saw a large symbol, a 6-pointed star, close to where he assumed the dome would be, about 175 kilometers to the west. It could be done. Mech, he yelled. I know you can hear me. Come down here now. If he refuses to help, I'll have to stay here. In less than 5 minutes, the mech came down the stairs. The soldier pointed to the star on the map. Is that the enemy dome? That is its approximate location. Are the tunnels clear? Probably not. How long would it take your mole to clear them? In the past, I have found that about 75% of the tunnels are ruined. If the percentage holds, the mole, with the speed of 5 kilometers per hour, could reach the dome in 28 hours. When will my armor be ready? It is ready now. The soldier, surprised and unsure of the mech's lack of resistance, hesitated. Will you help me get into the dome? Yes, Totaku, the mech said softly. So, he thought, that's it, for one of us. What I'd like to say, I suppose, is that I know you're different from me. Understand, I can't agree with your attitude, but I'll respect it. And I realize you've got something to care about. He paused, confused at his own emotions, and took a deep breath. I mean that if you're helping me because of the command I gave you, I release you from it. You don't have to go along. I am, as much as I can determine, self-motivated. I will go with you because I desire to do so. The soldier stared at the mech for a few moments. He didn't understand the mech any better, it seemed, than the mech understood him. Perhaps it didn't really matter. The soldier nodded. Thank you. The mech already had the armor's secondary systems on warm, and the soldier took another hour to check out the primary systems and bring the suit up to hot. The mech had gone off to prepare the mole and gather an assortment of weapons and material. When the exoskeleton was ready, the soldier paused a moment and just looked at it. The gray-black armor glowed as if it had been coated with oil. It hadn't looked as good the day it came off the production line. There was no doubt the mech was a genius with armor. Quickly now, unwilling to wait any longer, the soldier unplugged himself from the walker and stripped off his coverall. Naked, he levered himself into the gaping armor. He reached down and retrieved the coverall, and as he folded it, chided himself on his compulsiveness. I'll probably never wear this again, he thought, as he stowed the garment. He plugged in the secondary interface and felt his legs again. They twitched slightly, and he laughed. He attached the primary interface to the base of his skull and gasped as information from the entire electromagnetic spectrum flooded his neural system. Effortlessly, he controlled it, damping it, using or rejecting. He lay back in his armor and sent a sharp mental command. The suit closed, the seam once again invisible, and the helmet rose into place with a click. He sat and stood in one fluid motion, brushing the diagnostic equipment to the side. He raised his arms, and his hands struck the ceiling with a clang. He twisted, bent double, and touched his toes. Squatted. All his indicators, both helmet readouts and those on direct feed into his brain, were right on line. Perfect, he thought. The sun was just above the crater rim, and the sky was streaked with the reds of sunset. He ran up the winding path, quickly passing through the trees and over the stone bridge, enjoying his renewed strength and senses. On the rock shelf outside the cave, he found a mule, a 2-meter-long, 4-legged mech loaded with gear. The mech came out of the cave. How's the armor? Excellent, the soldier said. Are you ready? Yes, the mole is fueled and activated. It tapped the mule. I've included extra power cells for your cooler unit among the supplies. Fine, Let's go. The soldier ducked slightly and entered the cave, followed closely by the mule. The mech paused a few moments, then it turned and left the forest. With an electric snap, the deep blue sky turned scarlet, and jagged streaks of lightning flashed, filling the forest with strange light. Wind hissed through the trees, and their branches shook. The mole was waiting in a large tunnel about a kilometer from the forest. It was a 10-meter-long cylinder, 2.5 meters in diameter. It moved on a single continuous track. The soldier had never seen a machine like it before. "How does it work?" he asked. "It just melts the rock in front of itself, forces the melted rock into any fissures or cracks, leaving a smooth-surfaced tunnel behind. Any rock it can't use, it vaporizes and sends out its exhaust vents. It's cooled, but the gas is still about 110 degrees centigrade. A major part of its fuel consumption goes into cooling the exhaust." "My armor can handle about 200 degrees. "Even so, we'll follow about 500 meters behind the mole. It'll be a little cooler." The mole started up with a soft purr and moved ahead on its wide track, while the others waited. The mole hadn't gone more than 100 meters before it met with its first collapsed area. Wisps of incandescent gas floated out of the tunnel. Without another word, the mech entered the tunnel. The mule followed, and then the soldier. 3 hours later, the mole stopped, and the mech went forward with a new set of fuel cells. The soldier waited, squatting in the smooth, hot tunnel, and checked his circuits. The tunnel temperature was a tolerable 100 degrees centigrade. He felt a slight vibration and knew the mole was moving again. He followed, squat walking. The tunnel began to slope gently downward and eventually leveled off at 1,500 meters. The geothermal heat, coupled with the mole's exhaust, had driven the temperature to over 160 degrees. Inside the soldier's helmet, a small blue warning light began to glow. The exoskeleton's cooling system was straining. They were in one of the larger tunnels when the mech called out, "Unless my calculations are wrong, your 20th year has just begun." "Yes," the soldier said, wondering if the mech's calculations were ever wrong. "I'm getting some alarming readouts from the mole," the mech said. "There's a malfunction in the exhaust cooling system's circuitry." "What's that mean?" "If it fails, the tunnel will be uninhabitable for you." "Can you fix it?" "Of course, but it will take many hours." "How long before it fails?" "I estimate 6 to 8 hours." "We could reach the dome in another 8. The soldier paused. "Let's chance it and go on." "All right." The mole drilled its way into an open area 7 hours later, and the mech followed it out of the small tunnel. "Here it is," the mech called. "I think." Impatiently, the soldier pushed past the mule, knocking the small machine off its feet. He scrambled through the tunnel on his hands and knees. When he was clear, he stood up and stopped. The mech had switched on its floods, and the soldier could see that they were in a partially ruined transport station. A dozen meters away was a black wall. "No," he thought. More than black, a totally non-reflective surface that seemed to suck the light from the room. He walked forward slowly, past the mech and the mole. The mole was ticking softly as it cooled. Behind him, he saw the mole come out of the tunnel. When he was 5 meters from the dome wall, he began to feel a pulsing, as if he were being alternately pulled forward and pushed back. He stopped. His armor vibrated with a faint rattle. "How far down does it go?" "I don't know," the mech said. I didn't think it extended below the surface." "All right," the soldier said. "We go down too. There has to be some type of exit or entry port below the dome for mech miners, waste drains, something." "I agree, but first let me make some seismic tests. Maybe I can find something to aim for." "How long?" "An hour. I have to place the instruments." "Do it." The mech pulled its tools out of the mole's carrying rack and entered the tunnel. The soldier turned and walked away from the dome until he could no longer feel the pulsing. While he waited, he checked the fuel cells on the mole and found that they were almost exhausted. He knew the mech had changed them less than an hour before. He replaced the cells and settled down to wait for the mech's return. He was tired. Normally, it wouldn't have bothered him. He could go without sleep for almost 6 days, but the heat seemed to take a lot out of him. He checked his rebreather and cooling system and realized that he should recharge them, but he was so drowsy. When the mech gets back, he thought. He had just closed his eyes, it seemed, when he heard the sound of the mech in the tunnel. "I found something," the mech said. "What?" the soldier said, still muzzy with sleep. The mech went to the mole, saw that the fuel cells had been replaced, and turned to the soldier. "There's a large open area of about 1,700 meters down. It'll be steep, about 50 degrees, and the exhaust won't clear as fast. Maybe you should wait here while we do the hole." "No, it won't take more than 20 minutes. My armor can take it." The mech didn't argue. It turned the mole around, then jacked the rear end up to the proper angle. The mole started, and the blaze of light caused the soldier's sensors to blank out momentarily and then readjust. The transport station rapidly filled with dust and gas, and visibility dropped to almost zero. Again they waited. Then the mech entered the tunnel. Carefully, its legs and manipulators spread wide. It descended. Clouds of gas rolled out of the hole. The soldier anchored the first of his cables with a vibro bolt. There was nothing to hold on to, so he slid down on his back, playing out the cable slowly. Gradually, the heat rose. The blue warning light came on again, and the soldier began to sweat. At 600 meters, the soldier stopped and anchored the second cable with another vibro bolt. The first bolt vibrated itself out of the rock, and the soldier reeled in the first cable. As the heat increased, the soldier was glad he didn't have to try to walk. He wasn't sure he could do it. He felt weak and dizzy. His head ached, and there was a slight cramping in the muscles of his arms and back. Twice the mech stopped the mole and replaced the fuel cells, and once more the soldier changed cables. He could no longer tell if he was in an upright position. His vision blurred, and he knew it was more than just sweat in his eyes. Inside his helmet, to the left of his chin, a small yellow light began to pulse. The second warning. The armor was close to failure. He'd forgotten to recharge the cooling system and rebreather. He'd have to do it now. "Mech!" His voice was a croak that even he couldn't understand. He hit the release on the cable feed and slid forward. At that moment, the mole disappeared, and the soldier saw nothing beyond the mech but a gaping hole. The incandescent gas rushed out the hole with a loud roar, and the soldier, misjudging the distance in the maelstrom, crashed into the mech, breaking its grip. As the mech began to slide, the soldier threw himself forward and grabbed the mech's dorsal rack with both hands. For an instant, the soldier's feet held, sinking into the still molten walls, but the walls were too soft, and the mech's weight was too great. In that moment, the soldier almost released the mech. Then, with a lurch, they both fell through the hole. The soldier slammed against his restraints as his cable stretched taut and stopped their fall. As the two spun dizzily at the end of the cable, the soldier could see that they had come through the roof of a huge cavern. The dome wall was only meters away. The mole had fallen about 60 meters to the floor of the cavern and split open. Clouds of black smoke poured from the split, followed by snapping blue-white sparks. The mole was directly in front of an arched 10-meter portal in the dome wall. The in-and-out progress of dozens of vehicles had halted, and scores of exos were streaming around the fallen machine, heading for the portal. None of the exos were warriors. As the soldier watched, the opening in the dome began to darken. Then the mole exploded. The force of the blast slammed the soldier up against the ceiling, and the mech struck him across the chest. The soldier felt a sharp, agonizing pain, but he didn't loosen his grip on the mech. Again, they fell to the end of the cable, spinning and swinging. One edge of the net on the mech's dorsal rack broke, and a rain of weapons and equipment cascaded to the floor. Fighting the pain in his chest, the soldier released more cable from his belt, and he and the mech dropped to the floor. "Are you hurt?" the mech asked, clutching the soldier's shoulder. He suppressed the waves of nausea and vertigo that threatened to engulf him. "It hurts to breathe. I think some ribs are broken." All the activity had ceased, and nothing moved in the smoke-filled cavern. The mech's eyes turned to the portal, which was clear again. "The explosion must have damaged the mechanism that closes the portal." Painfully, the soldier reached behind him and released the cable reel. It swung free at the end of the long line, still anchored high above. As the mech moved about retrieving the scattered equipment that had fallen from its rack, the soldier walked into the enemy dome. "I've done it," he thought. Inside the dome on the first day of my 20th year. He reached over his shoulder, opened the small door on the top of his life support unit, and removed a small black cylinder from the specially modified niche he'd added so many months before. The mech joined him again. "What's that?" "Fusion bomb with a laser trigger. I built it just for this." Carefully, he set the timing mechanism. "How much time?" 15 minutes, or the cessation of my biofunctions, whichever comes first. It'll go off like a nova in a bottle. Come on, I want to get farther inside the dome." The room they were in appeared to be a storage depot of some sort, with tall stacks of material set in rows. They stood on a roadway which led to a door almost a kilometer distant. There were hundreds of vehicles on the roadway, but none of them moved. There were no exos in sight. "Come on," the soldier said as he moved toward the far door. His steps were jerky, and once he staggered. He felt almost continuous pain in his chest, and every jolting step was like the stab of a sword. Suddenly he coughed and lost all control of his armor. The enormous exoskeleton crashed to its knees and then fell forward onto the roadway. "Totaku!" The mech leaped to the soldier's side and rolled the armor onto its back. The soldier raged within his armor. So close! He tasted the sweet metallic flavor of blood in his mouth. He coughed again and almost passed out, sputtering and choking on the blood that welled into his throat. The mech loomed over him like a great silver insect. The fusion bomb slipped from the soldier's grip and rolled against one of the stacks. The mech grabbed the bomb and threw it toward the top of the nearest stack, which was over 100 meters high. It struck the edge and spun over the top. Carefully, the mech picked up the soldier, cradling him in its arms. "No farther, Totaku! You've done enough!" It carried the soldier out of the portal. The cable was still swinging when the mech reached it. They had been in the enemy dome less than 3 minutes. The mech caught the cable with its rear arms and hauled itself up with the soldier still in its front arms. Just as it was about to pull itself into the tunnel, the mech saw the portal start to close. It knew that when the portal was shut, the telemetric link between the bomb and the soldier would be cut. It scrambled up the slippery tube at top speed. The soldier was only aware of the pain. Then, when he realized that the mech was carrying him away from the dome, he knew anger, and he struggled to break the mech's hold. The mech slowed slightly, and the tunnel seemed to drop about a meter and then move sideways and back. Thin fissures appeared in the wall, and the tunnel behind disintegrated in a cloud of dust and debris. Chunks of rock fell on the mech, and it began to move again, trying only to get clear of the steep, deadly tunnel. There was no more resistance from the soldier. When the mech reached the ruined transport terminal, it saw that the black wall of the dome was still intact. One side of the room had collapsed, but most of the walls still looked stable. It lowered the soldier to the floor and bent over him. "Totaku," it said, "you did it!" The soldier could see the dome wall. It seemed to be at the end of a long tunnel, kilometers away. An aftershock shook the room with a dull rumble, and dust sifted down from the ceiling. "The dome held." His voice was barely audible. "Yes, but there's nothing but a firestorm inside, like a nova in a bottle." The soldier reached up and touched the mech lightly between its eye stalks. Then the hand slipped off the mech and dropped to the floor with an echoing clang. And the mech felt loss, and it knew the pain of grief, and realized with an overwhelming sense of both sorrow and joy what it meant. Nova in a bottle. It emitted a curious grating whine and trembled violently until its dorsal rack rattled. Then it was still again. A long, silent time passed before it carried the soldier's armored body from the ruined transport station. The air was like liquid gold when the mech buried the soldier. The grave was only a few meters from the kiosk, and the wind chimes filled the sunlit glade with their soft music. The sunset was exceptionally beautiful that evening. The mech watched the changing colors as it sat beside the grave. It stayed there, silent, still as a rock, until the stars shone with a beckoning brilliance. "When will you leave?" The guardian's voice came out of the darkness, soft, directionless. "In the morning," the mech said. "Will they clone him from that flesh?" "Yes, I think they will." It reached down and touched the small silver box that rested beside its foot. Once again it thought of the hand that lay frozen in the box. The hand of Totaku 2020, the clone, the hand that had touched the mech.